What if the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who buried your truth? In this gripping American family drama, a woman returns after years in silence to confront the very blood that betrayed her. Hidden wills, forged papers, and a stolen legacy unravel in a storm of revelations. As secrets are exposed and alliances collapse, she reclaims not just her name, but her voice. This is a story of quiet revenge, painful reckonings, and the courage to walk away from everything. Accept yourself. Stay until the end because the final truth changes everything. I bought my father a Mercedes S-Class. Black, sleek, top of the line. Exactly the kind of car he used to admire at the country club. It cost more than I paid for my Manhattan apartment deposit. A promotion bonus well spent, I told myself, a gesture of goodwill. A peace offering, maybe, or a final gamble. The drive from New York to Boston blurred past ivy-covered stone fences and changing summer leaves. My hands tightened on the steering wheel the closer I got to Brookline. Gregory Whitman's house, no, my father's house, loomed ahead like a monument to a life that had never made room for me. The Whitman estate had always stood still in time. Red brick, colonial, pillars at the entrance, gravel driveway meticulously raked. But for all its stately presence, it never felt like home. Not once. I parked the Mercedes neatly by the curb, adjusted my navy mood dress in the rearview mirror, and touched up my lipstick. Burgundy, not too bold, not too soft, just like he expected. Accomplished, composed, expensive, but never loud. I rang the doorbell, and it took exactly 13 seconds before the heavy door opened. He stood there in his pressed chinos and light blue shirt. No tie, but every button exact. "You're early," Gregory said, glancing at his watch. No hug, no smile. "I know," I replied, handing him the small box. "Happy Father's Day. I thought you might want to see it before the reunion tomorrow." He opened it slowly, eyes narrowing at the Mercedes emblem. "Is this a joke?" he asked. I gestured to the driveway. "It's yours." He stepped past me, stopped, and stared at the car with a critical squint. There was a flicker of something like pleasure before it vanished. "This is excessive, Madeline. What are you trying to prove?" "Nothing," I lied. "I got a big promotion. I wanted to do something special." He walked around the car twice, hands behind his back, like an investor appraising property. I waited for something? A thank you? A smile, a nod. Instead, he asked about insurance, depreciation, and maintenance costs. We took a short drive around the block where he complained the steering was looser than expected. When we returned, he parked it not in the driveway where it would be seen, but tucked away inside the garage. "Nice gesture," he said at last, tone cool. "But you must be doing very well to waste money like this." Later that evening, I sat alone in my hotel room, staring out over the Boston skyline. I called Taylor, my best friend, back in New York. "He put it in the garage," I told her. "Like a shameful secret." "You should take it back," she snapped. "He doesn't deserve it, or you." I didn't respond. The thought had crossed my mind, but I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. My purse sat on the bed beside me, unopened. Inside, folded and sealed, was the DNA result. I'd done the test 3 months ago out of pure curiosity, a whim fueled by late-night scrolling and a sale on ancestry kits. I wasn't expecting a revelation, just an understanding of my roots. Instead, I got a statistical impossibility. No paternal match. I didn't tell anyone. Not even Taylor, not at first, but something inside me had shifted. A question that had followed me since childhood, why didn't he love me the way he loved them, suddenly had an answer. He knew, I was almost certain, and that knowledge had shadowed every interaction, every missed birthday, every public correction, every "you should have done better." He had known, and he had punished me for it. Now, that truth sat in my purse like a loaded gun. I wasn't sure yet if I would use it. I had come for the reunion the same way I always had, with polished shoes and a smile that barely held. But this time, something felt different. Tomorrow, the Whitman family would gather. James would shake hands with donors and call it family bonding. Sophia would smooth every awkward pause with practiced grace. Mother would flit between guests, whispering apologies no one would hear, and I would sit there with a wine glass, a forced smile, and a secret that threatened to burn through my tongue. I reached for my purse. My fingers brushed the envelope. Just paper. Just data. But it felt like dynamite. Not tonight, I whispered to myself. Not yet. The reunion took place at the Brookline Country Club, naturally. Where else would Gregory Whitman host his annual showcase of carefully curated family perfection? The ballroom was draped in white linens and muted gold, the chandeliers dimmed just enough to flatter aging faces and ambitious young ones. I arrived fashionably late, as I always did. This time in a midnight silk dress that cost more than my father had spent on my college graduation. The hostess at the entrance looked confused until she saw my last name. Then came the familiar flicker of recognition, followed by the overcompensation. "Oh, you must be Madeline. Right this way. Your father said you'd be joining after the press dinner." Of course he did. He couldn't admit that I was staying at a hotel downtown, not at the family estate. That would ruin the illusion. The room buzzed with old money and polite ambition. James, my half-brother, was already at the center of a circle. Gray suit tailored to perfection, his hand on the shoulder of a senator's son. He saw me and offered a practiced smirk. "Madeline," he drawled, "you're here. How's the city treating you?" "Better than this place ever did," I said, sipping champagne. He chuckled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Still have that bite, huh?" Before I could reply, a voice chimed in. "James, could you help me with the donor packet? Sophia, half-sister, calm, blonde. Whitman Goldenchild." She didn't look at me until James walked away, then turned slowly, lips tight. "I see you brought the attitude, not a date. And you brought the pearls, not a personality," I replied. For a second, she almost smiled. We used to be close. Closer than either of us wanted to admit now. Then the voice I had been waiting for rang out, deeper, colder than the others. "Madeline." Gregory stood across the room, surrounded by men in navy suits and women in restrained gowns. He nodded once. No wave, no warmth, just acknowledgement. As if I were a vendor delivering a catered dish, not his daughter. I walked toward him, steady heels clicking on polished marble. "Father," I said, "how's the car?" "It drives." "I noticed you didn't mention it in your speech." He raised a brow. "This evening isn't about showmanship, Madeline." "No," I said, "just the illusion of a united family." Something flickered in his eyes, a twitch of the jaw, but he turned away before it could become anything more. As the night progressed, I moved through the crowd like a ghost, present but unseen, nodding at old professors, exchanging pleasantries with board members of the foundation my name had funded but never graced. And then I saw her. Her. The woman from the photo. The one I'd found in the envelope taped beneath my mother's jewelry box in her old apartment in Queens. Same chestnut hair. Same wary eyes. She was older now, thinner, wearing a name tag that read Elaine, M., one of the event staff. She didn't see me at first, but I saw her, and the world tilted. I followed her discreetly, waited until she stepped into the back corridor, a tray of empty flutes in hand. "Elaine," I said. She froze, turned, and for a moment we just stared at each other. "I don't know you," she said. "Yes, you do, or at least you knew my mother." "Catherine Whitman." She blinked. The tray shook slightly in her hand. "I think you delivered something to her once, something she never told anyone about." A pause, then a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." "I know, but I am. And I think you're the only person here who can. Tell me why my father treats me like I don't belong." Another pause. "There are things I promised never to say," she murmured. "Then maybe it's time to break that promise," I replied. She glanced behind her. "Meet me tomorrow. Café Trist. 9 o'clock I.M. I'll bring what I have." Before I could speak again, she disappeared down the corridor, swallowed by noise and clinking silver. I returned to the ballroom, hands trembling. Everything looked the same, but nothing was. I walked past my father, past Sophia's staged laughter, past James's insincere nod, and as I reached the door, I saw it. My Mercedes. Not parked out front, as I'd expected, but idling on the side, keys in the ignition. A valet. Waved awkwardly. "Your father said it was in the way." Of course it was. I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and stared at myself in the mirror. The DNA test. The photo. Elaine. Everything was beginning to unravel, and I was finally ready to pull the thread. Café Trist sat tucked between a yoga studio and an antique bookstore on Connecticut Avenue, its green awning faded by years of DC sun. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in black slacks and a navy coat, hair tied back in the kind of knot that said, "I didn't come to be seen. I came for answers." Elaine was already inside. She sat in a corner booth, half hidden behind a fake fern, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. When she looked up, her eyes flicked over me with the wary recognition of someone who'd spent too many years dodging shadows. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd talk." We didn't waste time. No small talk, no smiles, just the low hum of jazz playing overhead and the clink of ceramic cups around us. Elaine slid a padded envelope across the table. Her fingers hesitated at the edge, as though letting go meant crossing some line she swore never to touch again. That envelope came to Catherine 28 years ago. No return address, just her name and a Midtown P.O. box. Inside was a letter, yellowed slightly with time. It was typed, unsigned, and dated a month before my birth. "Your child is not his. You know that. You knew when you married him. Don't let him take her from you. He will never see her as his own." I read it twice, then looked up. "Did my mother ever say who sent this?" "No." Elaine's voice was terrified. Said if Gregory ever found out, he'd bury it and her. My fingers traced the edge of the page. "So she buried it first?" Elaine nodded. "She told me once, years later, Madeline's birth saved me, but it also tied me to the worst mistake of my life." I flinched. "She meant Gregory?" Elaine looked away. "No, I think she meant someone else. Someone she left behind. The kind of man you never bring into a Whitman estate." I stared at the envelope. "Do you know who my biological father is?" She hesitated, then. "There was a man, a mechanic, Queens. She met him when she ran away for 3 months before the wedding. I think his name was Robert. Or Raymond. He had a shop near Sunnyside." That one sentence cracked something open in me. My mind flashed to the way Gregory looked at me when I brought home my first report card from NYU. Perfect grades, a scholarship, and a fellowship offer. Still, he barely glanced at it. But when James got a B+ in economics, he bought him a car. I was never his, not really. And now I knew why. I stared down at the letter again. "Why now, Elaine? Why show me this, after all these years?" Her eyes met mine, steady and sad. "Because you came back. Because you're asking the questions she was too scared to. And because you deserve to know that you weren't the mistake." I swallowed hard. The envelope felt heavy in my lap. 100 pounds of buried truth wrapped in one creased piece of paper. Elaine finished her tea. "There's more," she said, "but I can't be the only one to tell it. Talk to Dr. Lindholm. He used to be Catherine's therapist." "You think he'll talk?" "I think. He remembers what she tried to forget. And if you're smart, you'll ask him about the blue tapes." I blinked. What blue tapes? Elaine stood, gathering her coat. She used to record herself. Not journals, confessions, late nights after your father went to bed. I only know because once she mailed one to the wrong address. To me. It was her voice shaking, saying she wasn't ready to die with that truth inside her. She paused. I burned it. I was scared. I regret that. I sat frozen as she left. I watched her disappear into the cold. Blue tapes, a therapist, a mechanician, queens. I was unraveling, and it was no longer about revenge. It was about finding out who the hell I really was. The nameplate outside his office read Dr. Samuel Lindholm, Ph.D., clinical psychologist. The hallway was quiet, carpeted in dull gray, and smelled faintly of coffee and Lysol. I stood there longer than I should have, the envelope from Elaine tucked inside my coat, the letter folded and refolded until the crease felt like a scar on my palm. I knocked once, the door opened slowly, revealing a tall, soft-eyed man in his 60s with a trimmed beard and a Columbia sweatshirt beneath his blazer. He blinked when he saw me. "You're Madeline," he said, not a question. "Yes, Catherine Whitman's daughter." He nodded once. "Come in." His office was warm. Leather armchairs, shelves lined with thick medical texts, and a few novels. The blinds were drawn, but soft light filtered in. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, not knowing where to begin. "I need to know the truth about my mother," I said, "and the blue tapes. Elaine said you might understand." His face shifted, nostalgia flickering into grief. "I haven't heard anyone mention those in over 20 years. Do they still exist?" He studied me for a moment. "Why are you really here?" "Because she died without telling me who I was. And because I've spent most of my life being treated like a children stranger in my own family. I want the truth, not the Whitman version of it." He leaned back. "Catherine began seeing me 6 months after your birth. She came to me, fragmented. She was living in a world she didn't choose, married to a man she feared more than she loved, raising a child who reminded her of everything she left behind. That child was me." "Yes, and she loved you, Madeline, fiercely. But love alone didn't save her from drowning in guilt." I pulled the envelope from my coat, set it on the coffee table. "Did she ever talk about the letter? The one that warned her Gregory wasn't my father?" He didn't touch it. "No, but she did talk about a man. She never said his name, but she called him the quiet before the storm. Said he was the only time she ever felt seen." I swallowed. "She recorded tapes. Late at night? Did you hear them?" He hesitated. "Not all. She sometimes brought snippets into session. Most were raw. Stream of consciousness. She'd talk about leaving, about staying for your sake, about being afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. Do you have them?" He stood, crossed the room, and unlocked a drawer. Inside was a small black cassette box, worn but intact. He opened it and pulled out 3 tapes, each labeled in Catherine's handwriting. One read, November 3, 1999. "What? He doesn't know." Another, May 17, 2002. "I saw Robert again." The last, January 12, 2005, "For her eyes one day." He handed them to me, his expression grave. I kept them because I didn't know if one day she'd need them. Or you would. I cradled the box like a fragile organ. "Is there anything else I should know?" "She was planning to leave. You were 10. She had filed preliminary paperwork for separation. She wanted to take you with her, but then Gregory found out. And everything changed. She withdrew, canceled sessions, sent me a check for the rest of the year, and disappeared." A silence settled between us. "She stayed because of me." "No," he said gently. "She stayed because of what he threatened. Full custody, a media smear. She thought he'd paint her as unstable. She didn't think anyone would believe her. I stood slowly, gripping the tapes. I'm going to listen to them. He nodded. Be careful, Madeline. There's comfort in answers, but there's also danger. Your mother left you the truth, but she also left you the burden of what to do with it. Outside, the air had grown colder, the afternoon dimming into a steel-gray sky. I walked to my car, the cassette box clenched like a secret finally unearthed. When I slid into the driver's seat, I stared straight ahead, my breath fogging the windshield. I hadn't cried in years, but something in me cracked. Not from grief, not from rage, from the quiet recognition that the story I'd been told was a lie, one carefully rehearsed, framed in mahogany and gold. And the real story? It was buried in the voice of a woman who had loved in silence, feared in silence, and left behind a map made of broken whispers. I didn't know where it would lead me, but I was ready to follow. The static on the cassette tape was like a low tide rolling in my ears. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my rented apartment, a cheap Sony Walkman in hand, the headphones pressing too tightly against my temples. The tape was labeled in my mother's delicate script, January 12, 2005, for her eyes one day. Her voice crackled through the speakers, lower than I remembered it, as though the years had preserved something truer than memory ever could. If you're hearing this, Madeline, then I failed. I didn't leave. Or I left too late. Either way, you're looking for answers I should have given you face to face. The breath hitched in her voice, and I felt my throat mirror her ache. They told me not to marry him, Gregory. They warned me he was cruel in private, charming in public. But I was 19 and scared and pregnant, and Robert, your real father, had already been sent away. Not because he ran, because my father paid him to. I froze. He was a mechanic, hands rough, eyes soft. We met one summer at Grandma June's. I never stood a chance. When I told him I was pregnant, he asked me to run away with him. Said he'd take us anywhere, but by then, the Whitmans had decided they needed a respectable marriage, not a scandal. The words lodged in my chest like splinters. My mother wasn't broken. She had been silenced. I wanted you to know him. I swear I did, but your grandfather threatened to cut me off, and Gregory, he made it clear I'd never see you again if I left. So I stayed, and every time I looked at you, I saw Robert. Not just in your eyes, but in your kindness, your stubbornness, your laugh. I let the tape run. Her voice faded in and out, haunted by years of repression. I listened until it clicked off with a final snap, the kind that feels like an ending. I sat there, unmoving. Somewhere in Fresno, there was a man named Robert, my biological father. Erased by money and fear, buried under decades of silence. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I reached for my laptop, opened a private browser, and typed, Robert Langston, mechanic, Fresno County 19882-005. Pages loaded. Obituaries. Workshop listings. One article from a 1991 local paper popped out. Langston Auto Repair expands in East Fresno. And a photo. He stood in front of a garage, grease on his hands, smile unfiltered, a cigarette tucked behind one ear. There was something in his posture, the slope of his shoulders, that mirrored mine. I scrolled faster. An online review thread mentioned his retirement in 2012, then a recent Yelp post. Langston & Sons reopened under new management. Family-owned since 1980. Family-owned. Yet other children. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could stop, pretend none of this happened, live with the knowledge and keep the peace. But peace had never belonged to me. It was given to Elaine and Trevor and everyone else who played the Whitman game better than I did. I copied the shop's address. Langston & Sons, 842 Cypress Avenue, Fresno. I packed a small bag, shoved the cassette tape and letter into the side pocket, and left the apartment without turning off the lights. The drive took 4 hours. I watched the landscape blur, suburbs giving way to open roads, chain restaurants dissolving into dusty stretches of farmland. The sun began to dip as I pulled into a small parking lot nestled between a pawn shop and a taco stand. A rusted sign with fading white letters swung above the garage. Langston and Sons Automotive. My heart beat so loudly I thought it might burst through my ribs. I stepped out. The air smelled like oil and burnt rubber, and beneath it, something strangely familiar, like the garage behind Grandma June's house where I used to sneak in to escape holiday dinners. A man in his late 40s emerged from the side door, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked up, confused but polite. "You need help with your car?" I shook my head slowly. "No, I'm looking for Robert Langston." He paused. "My dad, he's in the back changing out a carburetor. You a friend?" The word clung to my tongue. "Not exactly." He narrowed his eyes slightly. "You okay, miss?" I nodded. "Barely. Wait here. I'll get him." As he disappeared into the garage, I felt the wind shift. Inside my coat, my mother's voice echoed like a warning, a blessing, a dare. "Someday, when you're ready, find him and tell him I never stopped loving him, even when I was too afraid to stay." I didn't know what I'd say, or what he'd see when he looked at me, but the door was opening again, and so was everything else. The man who stepped out from the garage didn't look like the ghost I had imagined all my life. He was real, tangible. Slightly hunched from years of manual work, with hands that bore the wear of 1,000 repairs, his silver hair was pulled back in a tie, and he walked with the measured caution of someone who had learned not to expect surprises, at least not good ones. "Robert Langston?" I asked, though I already knew. He blinked, looking me up and down as if searching for recognition in a stranger's face. "That's me. I think you knew my mother. Eleanor Whitman." His breath caught in his throat. For a moment he just stood there, motionless, rooted in the cracked pavement beneath his boots. His hands trembled slightly, and I could see him doing the math in his head. My name, my face, the decades. He started, then stopped. "You're her daughter?" I nodded. "Madeline." He staggered back half a step and braced himself against the hood of a beat-up pickup truck. "I knew this day might come," he whispered. I reached into my coat pocket and handed him the cassette tape and the letter. He held them like sacred artifacts, staring at her handwriting as though he were afraid it might fade if he blinked. We didn't speak for a long while. He led me into a small break room in the back of the garage. There was a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 90s, and a tiny TV mounted in the corner playing reruns of Wheel of Fortune on low volume. He sat across from me at a round table, the cassette player between us. "I waited for her," he finally said. "I used to park outside the Whitman house when she was pregnant with you, just to see her silhouette in the window. Your grandfather had his men follow me. Said if I didn't disappear, Eleanor would pay the price." "She thought you left," I said softly. "I never left her. I was driven out." Silence folded in again, a heavy silence, not from awkwardness, but from truths too big to speak. "I didn't come here to ruin anything," I said. "I just needed to know if I was ever wanted." His eyes snapped to mine, glassy, raw. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me. I begged to raise you, but the Whitmans don't beg. They eliminate." I clenched my fists under the table. "They told me my father was an abusive man. That's how they justified everything. Their cruelty, their distance." His lips twisted into a bitter smile. "That sounds like Gregory. He needed you to hate me, needed a reason for you to see him as your only option." My mind raced. Suddenly, things I'd suppressed made more sense. The unexplained fear my mother carried, the way she flinched when my grandfather raised his voice, the locked drawer she kept in her study where the tape had been buried for years. "I want the truth," I said. "All of it." He nodded, steadying his breath. "I'll give it to you, but know this. Your mother was braver than you think. She risked everything, to leave clues behind for you. You're the reason I kept this place running. I hoped one day you'd walk through that door." A knock interrupted us. The man who had greeted me earlier leaned in. "Sorry, Dad, you're gonna want to see this." We followed him outside, where he pointed to the curb. A black town car sat idling, tinted windows up. A moment later, the back door opened, and out stepped Trevor Whitman. Of course. Dressed in his signature smugness and a tailored coat that probably cost more than my car, he adjusted his sunglasses and looked right at me. "I figured you'd end up here," he said smoothly. "You always had that stubborn streak, Maddie." Robert stepped protectively in front of me. "You're not welcome here," Trevor smirked. "I'm not here to fight, just to remind my dear sister that she's poking around in things better left buried. The Whitman name has weathered bigger scandals than an old mechanic's love affair." I felt the fury boil beneath my skin. "So you've known all along." "Oh, we all knew," Trevor replied. "Why do you think? They kept you in the dark." "Gregory didn't want competition, and Elena, well, she stopped being useful once she started remembering her own worth." I took a step forward. "You think you can scare me back into silence?" Trevor's grin faltered. Just slightly. "I'm not scared anymore," I said. The town car pulled away, tires hissing like a warning. Robert turned to me. "You've stirred the nest now, Madeline. They won't play there." I stared down the road. "Good," I said. "Neither will I." The next morning, I woke to the low murmur of NPR on the old radio in the kitchen and the sharp scent of black coffee. Robert was already up, dressed in his navy work shirt, his hands stained with fresh oil. It was strange how quickly the presence of a man I had never known could feel stabilizing, like something had quietly clicked back into place during the night. We didn't speak much over breakfast, just the occasional passing of toast, the silent refilling of my mug, but there was something grounding in the simplicity. No lies, no performance. Just two people starting to stitch together a broken thread. After he left for the garage, I sat at the table and replayed Trevor's words in my mind like a broken cassette. "You're poking around in things better left buried." That smug tone, that veiled threat. But beneath it, panic. Trevor wouldn't have come all the way out here unless something I'd uncovered could unravel everything. I pulled out the battered file folder Robert had given me the night before, one Eleanor had apparently left with him before she died. Inside were scraps, photocopies of birth certificates, half-faded letters, and a single black-and-white photograph of my mother standing next to Robert in front of this very garage. She looked young, brave, defiant. At the bottom of the folder, a sticky note with Eleanor's handwriting. "If anything happens to me, give this to Madeline. She deserves to know." That was the moment I decided I couldn't keep hiding in small-town safety. There were questions still burning, and now I had pieces of the puzzle Gregory Whitman never meant for me to find. By noon, I was back on the road to Chicago. The city's skyline emerged like an accusation, steel and glass rising above decades of lies. I checked into a discreet hotel under my middle name, Elise, and pulled out my laptop. Step 1, build a timeline. Eleanor's medical records, court documents from the Whitman Foundation, and, if I could find it, the original will she'd supposedly rewritten before her death. What I didn't expect was to find an online forum post from a former employee of Whitman and Sloan, the law firm tied to my grandfather's estate. Buried in a whistleblower thread from 2 years ago was a single comment that made my blood run cold. There was a revised testament from Eleanor W., never filed, locked in cabinet 3B, access only through Gregory. A secret will. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I needed that document. That night I called a number I hadn't dialed in years. Maya, my old college roommate, and now a paralegal at Whitman and Sloan. We hadn't spoken since I left the foundation. I half expected her to ignore me. She answered on the second ring. Maya, it's Maddie. Silence. I need your help. It's about my mother. There was a pause, then a cautious, "What do you want to know?" I think Gregory suppressed her real will, and I think it's still in your archive. That's not something you should say over the phone. Maya, please. If there's a way to prove Eleanor didn't want Gregory as executor, I remember the day she came in. Maya interrupted. She looked sick, scared. She said she wanted everything to go to someone named Robert Langston. And my heart kicked against my ribs. Then why didn't it happen? She never got the chance to sign it. Gregory showed up before she could. The document disappeared. I gripped the phone tighter. Do you know where it is now? Maya hesitated, then whispered, "Come by tomorrow. After 6. I'll leave something in the side elevator, 3rd floor, filing cabinet 3B. I hung up and stared out the window as the city lights flickered below. This wasn't just about family anymore. It was about legacy. About theft. About Eleanor's voice. Silenced once already, but not this time. As I crawled into bed that night, I didn't feel fear. I felt fire. The next evening, I waited until the office tower emptied out, just as Maya instructed. Dressed in a navy hoodie and jeans, I looked like any other late-night intern running errands. But inside, I was trembling with a strange mix of adrenaline and dread. If anyone caught me, I'd be trespassing. If I failed, Eleanor's truth might be lost forever. The side elevator dinged open without a soul in sight. As it creaked up to the 3rd floor, I stared at the numbers ticking upward and silently repeated Maya's words. Cabinet 3B, left corner, use the flashlight, top drawer, don't touch the cameras. I slipped into the archival room. Rows of gray steel filing cabinets standing like soldiers in a morgue. The room smelled faintly of dust and lemon disinfectant. My steps were light, heart pounding in my ears. I found 3B in the back left corner, exactly where she said it would be. The top drawer opened with a hiss. A slim flashlight. A stack of decoy case files. Then, underneath a false panel taped together in a plastic sleeve, an envelope marked in red, Codicil, Eleanor Whitman. My fingers shook as I peeled it open. There it was. A signed, notarized will. She had named Robert Langston as the legal executor of her estate. She had amended her original directive to split assets between him and Madeline Elise Whitman, biological granddaughter, with explicit instructions to investigate any manipulation by Gregory Whitman or his legal team. It was dated 2 weeks before her death. 2 weeks. And yet no one had ever mentioned it. Suddenly, I understood why Gregory had been willing to banish me, to erase me from the family. Not because I was irrelevant, but because I was dangerous. I tucked the will back into its sleeve, secured it in my backpack, and slipped back out the same way I came, heart pounding, but hands steady now. Back at the hotel, I called Robert. "You were right," I told him. "Eleanor never wanted Gregory in charge." There was a silence on the other end, then his voice choked. "She said she'd fix it, but I didn't think she had time. She did, she tried, and now we have proof." "Then it's time," he said, slow and firm. "Time to make this public." The next morning, I walked into a modest law office on Wabash Avenue. I had chosen carefully a small but fierce firm specializing in estate fraud. The senior partner, Victoria Kane, had built a reputation on going toe-to-toe with wealthy patriarchs and exposing suppressed wills in high-profile cases. I laid the document on her desk and explained everything. She read silently, her red-rimmed glasses sliding down her nose, then leaned back in her chair. "This changes everything," she murmured. "If this is real, and I believe it is, you're about to blow a $12 million 0-cents estate wide open, but Gregory won't go down quietly." "I'm not asking him to," I said. I'm just making sure my mother's voice is finally heard. Victoria nodded, then slid a folder toward me. Let's get started. But Madeline, once this goes to probate court, it becomes public. Are you ready for that kind of storm? I paused. I thought of Eleanor, alone in that hospital room, of Robert, fixing broken engines and broken truths from behind a dusty counter, of Gregory, sipping brandy in his leather chair, confident that the world would never know, and I thought of myself, once the family ghost, now the woman holding the match. I was born in a storm, I said. This time, I'm walking straight into it. As I left the building, the wind caught the hem of my coat, and I felt it again, that same cold air from Eleanor's funeral. But this time, it wasn't biting. It was cleansing. The reckoning had begun. The courtroom smelled of stale coffee and institutional carpet, but to me, it might as well have been a battlefield. The mahogany-paneled walls, the rows of somber observers, the judge perched high like a god with a gavel, none of it intimidated me anymore. I had walked too far in the dark to shrink under fluorescent lights. Gregory sat 3 tables ahead in a tailored navy suit, silver cufflinks glinting beneath the sleeves. He didn't look at me. Not once, but his posture gave him away, rigid, jaw-clenched, fingers gripping the chair's edge like a man clinging to the last illusion of power. Victoria Kane, calm as ever, placed the amended codicil neatly on the evidence cart. Your Honor, what we have here is a legally binding document signed by Eleanor Whitman, verified by notary, and suppressed by the current executor, Mr. Gregory Whitman. A murmur rippled across the courtroom. The judge, a seasoned woman with ice-gray hair and sharp eyes, lifted her gaze. Mr. Whitman, do you deny having knowledge of this document? Gregory stood slowly, voice measured. Your Honor, I've never seen that version before. It's fabricated, clearly an attempt to claim a false stake in my mother's estate. Victoria's voice remained steady. Then you're accusing the notary of forgery? Because she's willing to testify. Under oath. His jaw twitched. For the first time, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not rage, not arrogance. Fear. Over the next 3 hours, documents were laid bare. Hospital visit records, financial withdrawals, Eleanor's final audio message discovered by Robert and played on speaker. If something happens to me, and Gregory takes control, Madeline must know the truth. She is the only one who has ever reminded me of what it meant to fight for something. I regret not telling her sooner. I pray this codicil finds her. My hands trembled in my lap. I heard the gasp from someone in the gallery. Maybe it was Aunt Marianne. Maybe it was no one, time blurred. When the recording ended, there was silence. Deep, uncomfortable. Then Victoria rose again. Your Honor, this is not about revenge. It is about justice. Eleanor Whitman's voice was silenced once in life. Let's not allow it to be silenced in death. The judge nodded slowly, then turned toward Gregory's counsel. Anything to add? The attorney stood and fumbled through a few pages before muttering, We request time for independent verification. Granted, but know this, the judge said, peering over her glasses. If this document holds under scrutiny, the court will recommend full probate review and the possible removal of Mr. Whitman as executor. Gregory's face cracked, not visibly, but I could feel it. The quiet unraveling of a man who had built his kingdom on secrets. One document, one recording, one granddaughter was all it took to shatter it. Outside the courthouse, reporters were already gathering. I avoided the microphones. I didn't come for headlines. I came to reclaim what was rightfully mine and my mother's. Robert stood waiting beside my rental car, hands in his pockets. You did it, he said softly. No, I replied. She did. I just carried the torch. He smiled, eyes glassy. Your mother would be proud. I looked toward the horizon, where the courthouse dome cast a long shadow over the streets. This wasn't over, not yet. Gregory would fight, appeal, spin narratives, but I no longer feared his stories, because now I had one of my own, and it was louder, truer, and finally being heard. 2 days after the hearing, I returned to the Whitman estate, not as a castaway knocking for scraps, but with a court-appointed inspector and the keys Gregory was legally forced to surrender. The gate still creaked the same way, the gravel still crunched underfoot, but everything felt different. Inside, the house reeked of dust and dried-out pride. The portraits in the hallway, Gregory shaking hands with city councilmen, Eleanor at charity galas, hung untouched. Her smile in those photos looked forced now, hollow, the kind a woman wears when she's too tired to resist but too proud to surrender. I wandered through the rooms slowly. The piano still stood by the sunlit corner where I used to sit, pressing keys with fingers too small to reach octaves. In the library, Eleanor's scent lingered faintly, lavender and worn paper. There, in her writing desk, tucked behind an envelope labeled "For Her," I found a second letter. Madeline, if you're reading this, it means the truth found you. Not all truths are kind. Some are heavy. But you were always strong enough. I'm sorry for the silence. I believed protection looked like distance. I was wrong. Don't become me. Don't bury your love beneath logic and fear. Take back what they stole from you, from your mother. Make it your own. My fingers shook as I folded the letter, heart thudding with a strange mix of sorrow and clarity. Eleanor had failed my mother, had failed me. But she tried. Perhaps too late, but she tried. And now the baton had passed. By the time I reached the guest room where my mother once stayed, the sun was setting. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the spot where her suitcase once stood, her dreams crumpled beneath Gregory's orders. I imagined her brushing her hair in silence, wondering why no one came to knock, to say goodnight, to say, "I see you." That night, I didn't stay at the estate. I drove back to my motel, surrounded by yellowed curtains and a heater that groaned. But it felt more honest than the marble floors I'd walked through all day. The next morning, the press finally caught up. A woman in a gray coat stopped me outside the diner. "Ms. Whitman, do you have a comment about the probate filing?" I looked at her, steady. "No, but I have a question for all of you. Why does it take a court ruling for a daughter's voice to matter?" She blinked, taken aback, and then she wrote it down. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the court. The codicil had been authenticated. Gregory's role as executor would be suspended pending further proceedings. The estate would undergo a formal review, and I would be granted temporary stewardship. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "Madeline?" The voice was low, hesitant. "It's Marianne. I didn't know. About your mom. About what Gregory did." I said nothing. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry." "Were you sorry when she left?" I asked quietly. "When I was 15 and slept on couches while the family vacationed in Europe?" A long pause. "No," she admitted. "I was complicit. We all were." "Then don't say sorry now. Say it to the next girl who gets erased." I hung up. I didn't need apologies. I needed reckoning. That night, I walked alone to the beach near my motel. The wind whipped through my coat, salt biting my lips, but the sky, wide and unafraid, reminded me what freedom felt like. Not in marble halls or trust funds, but in the ability to speak without permission, to walk away without guilt, to rewrite your name in a book they tried to close. Gregory hadn't called. He wouldn't. Power doesn't apologize when it bleeds. It retreats, festers, waits to strike again. But I wasn't that scared 15-year-old anymore. I was Madeline Whitman, and I was no longer knocking on the door. I had the master key. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. Not in temperature, But in memory, gray walls echoing footsteps, murmurs bouncing between marble pillars. I sat alone at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a black suit that once belonged to Eleanor. It still smelled like cedar and defiance across from me. Gregory adjusted his tie with hands that once held a bourbon glass more than they ever held mine. His lawyer, a younger man in a stiff gray blazer, leaned over and whispered something. Gregory didn't respond. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead, not once meeting mine. The probate judge entered, brisk and unsmiling. Her voice cut through the murmurs like a scalpel. This hearing is a continuation of the matter regarding the contested codicil and amended executorship of the Whitman estate. My attorney stood and presented the files we had spent weeks compiling: Eleanor's handwritten codicil, her therapist's notarized letter confirming their final sessions, financial documents showing the trust allocations Gregory had adjusted without consent. And finally, the audio file. I had found it in the very last cassette, labeled Lake House 2005, a private conversation between Eleanor and Gregory, never meant for anyone but her ears. But she'd saved it anyway. In the recording, Gregory's voice was unmistakable. Calm, controlled, cruel. She made her choice when she walked out. You don't owe her anything, Ellie. And then Eleanor's voice breaking. She didn't walk out, Greg. You pushed her. Silence followed. Then, a chilling chuckle. And if I did, she was always a weak link. The courtroom was dead silent when the audio stopped. Even Gregory's lawyer looked down, color drained from his face. The judge looked at him, then at me. Ms. Whitman, do you wish to make a statement? I stood slowly. My legs trembled, not with fear, but with gravity. I looked around the room, filled now with distant cousins, local press, and a few old faces from my childhood. I found Marianne in the back row, her eyes downcast. I came here not to fight over a fortune, I began, voice even, but to reclaim a story. I paused. No one breathed. For years, this family pretended my mother didn't exist, that I was just some distant niece who got in the way, but my name is Madeline Whitman. And my mother, Camille Whitman, was not a mistake to be erased. She was a woman who gave her life for me and was cast aside by the very man who sits across from me now. I turned to Gregory. You buried her memory under marble and silence. Thought I dug it back up. Every document, every recording, every name you tried to delete, I found them. And now they live. I faced the judge again. This isn't about revenge. It's about truth, and I won't let it die again. The judge nodded. This court recognizes the validity of the codicil. Gregory Whitman is hereby removed as executor, effective immediately. Control of the estate shall be transferred to Madeline Whitman pending final distribution of assets per the amended trust. There was no applause, no music swelled, just silence. Gregory didn't protest. He didn't speak. He simply rose, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out. Past me, past the portraits in the hall, past Eleanor's name carved into stone. And just like that, the man who ruled over this family for decades disappeared behind heavy oak doors, silent and small. Outside, the autumn air felt different, crisp, electric, like something had been broken open and light was leaking in. As I stood on the courthouse steps, reporters shouted my name. I said nothing. I just looked at the sky. Somewhere behind the clouds, my mother's voice echoed in memory. Don't become me. Don't bury your love beneath logic and fear. I hadn't, not this time. And the story wasn't over yet. The estate looked nothing like the place I remembered, not because the house had changed. It hadn't. The hedges were still trimmed with surgical precision, the fountain still spouted in the same rhythm, but the silence had shifted. For the first time, it wasn't hollow. It was full of memory. And I was the one Holding the key, I stepped into the foyer with a quiet that echoed louder than any slam of a door. A few staff still remained, most unfamiliar. They watched me like a ghost had returned. In a way, one had, but not the one they expected. In the study, I opened the last drawer of the old mahogany desk, the same drawer I used to sneak candy from as a child when no one was watching. At the bottom was a photograph, my mother, maybe 25, standing on the beach with the wind in her hair. Her eyes weren't sad. They were daring the world to try her. I slipped the picture into my coat pocket. That afternoon, I called the foundation lawyer and signed over the lake house to the local domestic violence shelter. It would become a haven for women like Camille. Women who needed somewhere to breathe, to begin again. I could almost hear her voice approving softly from the porch swing. The next day, I stood by her grave with nothing rehearsed. I brought no flowers, just myself. I did it, Mom. A breeze rolled across the grass, bending the tall weeds and stirring the bouquet someone else had left. Likely Marianne, maybe even Eleanor's old nurse. I crouched down and touched the stone. They won't erase you again, not while I'm still breathing. For a moment, the world fell silent again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt still, like the ending of a song you never wanted to end. The following weeks passed in a blur. Documents were signed, property transferred, names removed, and others restored. I declined interviews. I let the lawyers speak in press statements while I stayed in the shadows, where I had once been forced, and now chose to remain. One afternoon, I visited the Whitman Engineering Garage. Now mine. I hadn't stepped inside in years. The dust on the shelves whispered stories of everything I missed. But near the back, beneath a faded tarp, the Cobra waited. It was rusted at the edges, dented in places, but still intact, just like me. As I rolled up my sleeves and lifted the hood, Riley walked in. He was 15 now, tall and lanky, still growing into his limbs. He looked at the car, then at me. "Is that your grandfather's?" I said, "but now it's yours if you want it." He smiled slowly, then reached for a wrench without another word. We worked in silence, side by side, the way families sometimes do, when words aren't big enough for what they mean. Later that evening, as the sky melted into gold behind the garage windows, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Eleanor's blanket across my lap. Riley played with the dog in the yard. Inside, Marianne prepared dinner, humming something soft. We weren't the Whitmans they'd tried to manufacture, but we were the ones who survived. A letter arrived the next morning. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Eleanor's, neat and deliberate. It had likely been scheduled with her attorney to be mailed after the hearing. "If this reaches you, it means truth prevailed. I want you to know I loved your mother. I loved you. I wasn't strong enough to stop him, but you were. You always were." There were no tears left to cry, only a quiet nod to the sky. The legacy they'd tried to steal had found its rightful home, not in courtrooms or bank vaults, but in rebuilt trust, in old tools, in the sound of a teenager's laughter echoing through an honest garage. And when the time came, I would pass on not just the estate, but the truth. The whole truth. That some families are born, others are built, and the ones you build, if you do it right, can heal what the old ones broke. For the first time in my life, I was no longer trying to belong to the Whitmans. I was trying to build something better. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of truth, betrayal, and redemption. This story is for anyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or pushed aside, and chose to rise anyway. May it remind you that family isn't always who you're born to, but who stands beside you when everything falls apart. If this touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. See you in the next chapter.